181. Is there anybody that would like to testify on House File 181 that isn't on the agenda? With that, I call Representative Lucero to present testimony about House File 181 regarding the state aid resource created for school districts with low general education revenue per pupil and low property wealth per pupil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, thank you for having me, granting me the opportunity to be with you today to present this bill. And I want to give a little bit of background before I speak to the details of the bill. So I am going to start with reading a section of the Minnesota State Constitution. So Article 13, Section 1 reads as follows. Uniform system of public schools. The stability of a republican form of government depending mainly upon the intelligence of the people. It is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. The legislature shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools throughout the state. So that statement in the Minnesota State Constitution is extremely important because it recognizes the state's role in maintaining a thorough and efficient education system for all residents of Minnesota. In addition to the state funding portion of education, there's also the local funding. So education funding in total is a combination of state funding and local funding. And unfortunately, not all school districts, of which we have approximately 330 across the state, the geographic regions, the makeup of those school districts is obviously not uniform. And what I mean by that is the combination of homes, commercial industrial businesses, farms, or government-owned property, which isn't taxed at all. The makeup or the combination of those different types of districts creates different abilities for local school districts to tax. So for example, school districts that have a higher proportion of government-owned property, for example, they can't collect tax on that. Or school districts that have large portions of farms that make up the district in more rural parts of the state, there's a different ability to tax versus school districts that have regions that consist of commercial industrial property versus residential neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason that's important is because in each of those different types of properties are taxed at different rates. Obviously government being zero on the low end, and on the highest end it is commercial industrial property. So those districts which may have more commercial industrial property in them would enjoy the benefit then of being able to collect more revenue at the local level. So with that background, the 4 school districts that I have the privilege of representing, at least either all or in part, are Elk River, Buffalo, Monticello, and St. Michael Albertville. And the makeup of the area of 30B, which represents, or is the cities of Albertville, St. Michael, Otsego, Hanover, and the Wright County portion of Dayton. We are outside the 7-county metro area, and we are largely considered a bedroom community. And what a bedroom community means is of those different types of property that I was referencing, we're predominantly farm and residential. We lack commercial industrial businesses out in our area. So following the logic, if you can see what's going to happen, since commercial industrial property is taxed at the highest rates and thereby collecting the most revenue for a local school district, and because we are in the district the community that I represent lacks a significant portion of commercial industrial property, that means the tax burden falls disproportionately on the bedroom community, the residential property owners. So the natural consequence of that then is those areas of the state, when you combine the state portion of education with that which is collected locally, it is significantly less. And that's what brings me here today then with House File 181. What I have here is a table, which I know obviously you can't see. I only have one of these. I didn't think to bring more than one. I can certainly pass it around. And on the table here, we'll draw your attention to this green box down here. And what this shows is it demonstrates the term given out in our community known as equity in education funding, or more appropriately, inequity. So the current funding formula has created an inequity of the per pupil funding of those students that live in more urban areas of the state, such as Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other districts within the 7-county metro area that enjoy high commercial industrial properties, such as Wayzata, Minnetonka, and all those cities. So the per pupil funding between those, and then the students out in the areas, the area of the state where we live. Again, known as equity in education. And so the table that I have here, this is from last year's budget. So the budget year that we're just coming to an end here in a few months. It shows, for example, in fiscal year 2015, Minneapolis per pupil now, from the state, this is just state, received $11,389 per student. And that compares to St. Michael Albertville, which received $7,898 per student. That's a difference of $3,491 per student. That's known as the funding gap. And then I have that breakdown for each of the school districts for each of the 2 years. So between the FY15, which would have been the previous year to the budget cycle, then FY16, fiscal year 16, which is the first year of the budget cycle we're in, and then the second year, which is the year we're just ending, is FY17. So I'm showing those 3 years, so FY15, 16, and 17. And I'm showing how the gap continues to widen. And so if you follow that along for each of the 4 school districts that I represent, in the end here, so the budget cycle we're currently finishing up right now, this fiscal year, the gap is $3,616 per student for St. Michael Albertville student versus Minneapolis. So I can definitely pass this along if you want to look at that. So the consequences of the inequity gap are reduced educational opportunities. And some of the examples is I've spoken with the teachers, with the principals, and the superintendents of my school district, and the students and parents. Some of those educational opportunities, which are the natural consequence of lack of funding, are reduced number of foreign languages that are offered in the schools, for example. The number of arts courses or choir often take a hit. Some of the technology or STEM-related courses that might otherwise have been offered if there were a greater, if the funding gap was closed, there'd be greater educational opportunity in those areas. So there are many examples, but those are just a few of, unfortunately, what students out in the schools that are in my community are deprived of, those educational opportunities. In addition to that, it's described as a revolving door, where the just neighboring districts, 1 or 2 districts over from the community, the districts that I represent, are paying teachers $10,000 more on an annual basis. And so that creates a revolving door where the schools that I represent, they hire new teachers, they spend a tremendous amount of time, energy, and resources training new teachers, new to the profession, and then they're out the door. That comes at an incredible cost, because and it's a soft cost, not just a financial cost. It definitely has a financial cost, but there's also a soft cost. And that is when you're continuously bringing in new people and you're spending your energy to train up so that other districts can hire them away, they're now, those districts that are hiring the trained teachers away, don't have to spend their own resources and money to train, if that makes sense, into the field. So we become the revolving door. That's another consequence of the inequity in funding. So what House File 181 would do is it takes the 330 school districts, roughly 330, on a continuum, and it targets the bottom 20% of school districts that are being funded per pupil, and if they're in poverty poor districts. So a property poor district would be like what I was explaining, which would be farm, predominantly farm, and predominantly bedroom community. So they lack the commercial industrial property tax base. So if they're in the bottom 20% per pupil funding, and they're in a property poor region of the state, or if their district is property poor, they would then qualify or qualify under House File 181 definitions to have their per pupil funding targeted at them and increased to bring them closer to the state average. So with that background, Mr. Chair and members, I definitely am willing to entertain any questions I could answer regarding the bill.
Any questions for Representative Lucero? Ms. Grace Greason.
Mr. Chair. Representative Lucero, so are there any guidelines regarding what the districts can use the general education disparity aid on, or any restrictions to
No, there are not restrictions on how there are restrictions on how, if they qualify to receive it, but there aren't restrictions on what they're required to spend it on. So it would go into their general revenue bucket and allow them to spend it as they see fit to fulfill potential deficiencies of right now, so that they can use the dollars as wise as possible to create the greatest number of educational opportunities for their students.
Ms. Fatima Manawa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, in the bill it says a school district not including a charter school can qualify for the aid. What if, does this mean like a school district that includes a charter school can have the money but just not using a charter school, or just they can have it all?
Mr. Chair, and member, no, it would exclude charter schools from qualifying under this definition. Now, I understand that charter schools are, they are public institutions. This is targeting, at least this route, this version, to target the dollars at non-charter schools.
Mr. Nirasatupa.
Now, has the education commissioner testified in support for this bill?
Mr. Chair and member, the commissioner has not, to answer your question. I did not get a bill hearing this year on 181, so there was no testimony this year. But this is identical language to a bill that I had last year, and I forget the bill number last year. But I did receive a bill hearing, and my testifiers in support of the bill were school districts, several superintendents from the school districts that would be positively impacted by the bill.
Thank you.
Mr. Colin McConkey.
What was the opposition, or thank you, Mr. Chair, what was the opposition to your bill last year, and what was their argument?
Mr. Chair, remember, the primary opposition comes from those school districts that are on the other end, those that are benefiting from the current gap in the inequity. And the reason being is they're enjoying a position where they're receiving more money, and they view my bill as a bill that's going to take money away from them. And it depends on what your vantage point is. I personally believe that a child's or a student's education should not be dependent upon the zip code at which they live in. Everybody should be treated equal. The Constitution doesn't make a reference to the mandate by the Constitution. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that the current funding formula, which is the product of decades of complexities compounding upon itself, which gets us to the position we're in today, which is a funding inequity. I would suggest that in and of itself, the modern day funding formula, consequence thereof, is a violation of the state constitution. Because I would argue that is not fulfilling when it's denying or depriving students of certain educational opportunities. That is not satisfying the language that our Constitution requires. And so that's what the opposition is. And, I can definitely see what they're saying. But at the same time, we should all be treated equal. And there shouldn't be some students that are receiving thousands of more dollars in some school districts versus others that are not.
Ms. Emily Risberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Why exclude charter schools like right now with this? And are you expecting to include them in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Remember, the reason, when it comes to government policy and government language, is that you have to fight your battles incrementally. And so there's a huge challenge right now with the language as written. And so the more you add, obviously the more costly the bill will become. And so you have to pick your battles. And if we can get a success with round 1, then you come back with round 2 and round 3 and round 4. But when you load up an initial bill with too much, you get nothing. And so that's where it is. I just chose to draw the line because you have to cap the cost of the bills at some point, hopefully get a victory, and then come back. So the intent is to come back through incrementalism.
Ms. Heather Weller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, I was wondering if there are any other states who have had similar issues to this and what they have done to address the problem, and if those methods have worked, and how you can shape your legislation with that.
That's a great great question, Mr. Chair and Member. I do not know offhand of the funding equity. That's something, an area I haven't done research in what other states are doing. And so this was not shaped off of language in other states, but it was simply a recognition of a challenge we have here in our state. And so I suspect that other states, depending on their funding formula, and so this may be duplicative, because I don't know if it's been explained to you already, this group, but the funding formula is a base amount per student, and then you have categoricals, of which there's several dozen, I believe. And each categorical represents a different criteria for school districts in a particular school, students in a school district, that would add a few more dollars to the base. So every student, regardless of the zip code, gets the base, and then depending on the number of categoricals qualified for would be more revenue for that district. And so I don't know if other states have a similar funding formula. I suspect they do, with some variations, but it definitely is a challenge in our state. So I'm at a loss to answer what other states have done or the background.
Ms. Kieran Daniels.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for state funding and how much each area and district receives, are income and poverty levels a factor in the levels of funding? And if so, wouldn't that make the gap in funding reasonable? And I'd also like to know examples of school districts who testified in support of your bill.
Sure, Mr. Chair and Member, the answer to your first question, absolutely. There has to be a recognition that there are unique challenges to certain school districts. Where you have English as a second language, that naturally becomes a challenge in areas that have higher students with English as a second language. Naturally, we'll need more money to help with those unique challenges, right? And then every unique challenge that a categorical, for example, represents. There has to be a recognition of that, absolutely. So there will be differences in funding. But the question becomes, the funding level that we see before us today is the product of, as I mentioned, several decades compounding upon itself. And with any formula, as society has changed, as unique challenges have come up, as potentially some challenges that may have existed 25 years ago that may not be as pronounced today, every formula needs to be revised. And for the most part, as far as I understand, the funding formula has only been tinkered with just barely around the edges during the last several decades. There hasn't been a sit down and let's start from scratch and see if we can devise something that's more fair. So yes, while there's a recognition that there will definitely need to be funding gaps, the question is $4,000 per student, is that reasonable? And does that create a disparity which is not equal treatment and just goes beyond what's necessary? And then the second part of your question was, what are some of the school districts that testified? St. Michael Albertville was there. Let me think if I go back. Elk River Superintendent was there. Mr. Lundell was there. Brad Lundell, he's the the lobbyist for SEED, Center for Schools for Equity and Education, which represents, I think, somewhere around 1 or 2 dozen school districts that are in a similar position to the school districts that I represent. So those are the three that I can think of offhand, those superintendents.
Mr. Colin McConkey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you argue that funding for students is directly dispersed to the students? So, basically what I'm concerned about is that your bill isn't taking into consideration the size of facilities of the schools that the students are going to. So with the recent, like with the urbanization of Minnesota, and as well as like the amount of students in each school, so Minneapolis, as a school district, the schools are much, much larger than the schools in your district. And so their facilities are so much larger. So what I'm questioning is if this funding and the disparity in the funding is determined based on size of facility and like the necessity of the funding to maintain the facilities. And I was just wondering what you make of that and why, like, what you think that could mean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and member. The size of the facilities that are required to educate a student population is going to be dependent upon the size of that student population, right? So if, and since we're linking the dollars to each student, because that's how it's derived, it's per student, the number of dollars that go to a particular school district will be dependent upon, or based upon, the number of students in that school district, and then the number of facilities and the size of facilities is dependent upon the number of the students. That it's for that reason, it's all proportional. So it already has a built-in mechanism to account for a greater number of facilities based on a greater number of students will receive a greater number of dollars. But what we're focused, so that's already going to happen, but the gap between students there and students out in rural parts of the state is what we're addressing.
Mr. Garasutupa?
Does taking money from the Department of Education defund something else the Department of Education is already funding?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Remember the money, the House File 181 does not take money away from the Department of Education. It instead, it adds to, it's essentially another categorical. It adds another categorical that must be taken into consideration by the department when they allocate the funds that they send out to the different school districts. So that no money is being taken away from them, it just, it's criteria that they're required to take into account when they're allocating funds that they already have, or that are given to them, appropriated to them by the state.
Ms. Hannah Wayman?
Okay, so this might be a simple question, but I'm not really sure on like how taxes and those things work. But like, does the District of Minneapolis pay higher taxes, and is that why each child gets more funding? And then like, how is the funding being redistributed? So is the tax money that Minneapolis like citizens are paying, is that being given to like other districts, or like how exactly does that work?
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Remember the table that I have here, this is just state dollars. This does not take into account the local dollars. And so the way that taxes are collected at the local level is a school district determines what they want to spend, then they take that total number and they have to divide it up among their tax base within that school district. So the revenue collected within a school district stays in the school. The revenue collected by the school district at the local level for that school district stays with that school district. It is not redistributed and taken out or sent anywhere else. The money from the state is sent to the district, and so that's the amount we're discussing here. So to answer your first question, which is, could part of the disparity be the tax rate of a local jurisdiction? And the answer is no, because these are not based upon the local tax rates of a local jurisdiction. The exceptions would be, in terms of my part, the qualifier to my statement that money coming into a local district by a local district would not leave, would be open enrollment. So we have open enrollment in the state, which I'm a huge advocate of, which since the money follows the student, if under exercising the ability for open enrollment, a student in Minneapolis, for example, chooses to go to Richfield or Wayzata or any other school district, those dollars would then leave both the state and the local, well, let's see here. Yes, I don't know for sure if it's the local dollars, that much I don't know. I wonder if it's just the state dollars would follow the student, would leave that school district and go to the destination school district. So actually, you know what, that's a good question. So maybe, and just I'm thinking out loud here, it wouldn't make sense that the dollars collected at the local level would flow out of that district and go to it. That wouldn't make sense. So I think, I don't know the answer, but I would think it would be just the state dollars would follow the student.
Ms. Kira Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you had mentioned that some school districts were opposed to this because they thought money would be taken away from them, but they would still get the same funding. They wouldn't be brought down to like the average, it would just be school districts that are under the average, correct?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Member, so it depends on how you look at it. So you take an entire pot of money that's allocated from the state to the education budget. So whatever that total amount is, then that total amount is run through the funding formula and then spits out at the other end the dollars per student per district. And so using that formula, the next budget cycle, the potential certainly does exist because there's a requirement that certain, of the total dollars would then have to be allocated to the bottom 20%. The argument could be made that the districts at the top, dollars would either, they would not exercise an increase, or their increase would be smaller than it otherwise would have been, or they potentially could see a small decrease. Right? That potential does exist in order for dollars in the totality of the 330 to be allocated to help bring the bottom up. So that potential does exist. So I do acknowledge that. It is definitely a real risk. So, but then I come back to the question. Do those at the top who enjoy the most money, do they have an obligation to help those at the bottom? And is those at the bottom, we can't forget about those at the bottom because I go back to the statement. It shouldn't be dependent upon a student's zip code that dictates the educational opportunities that they have available to them. While at the same time, acknowledging that there are going to be, there needs to be extra dollars for certain challenges.
We have time for one more question. Ms. Grace Greason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what I'm wondering, is there a certain amount of revenue per people that the disparity aid is trying to allow each district to achieve? Or is there by district, or is there a
Mr. Chair and member, there's not a set dollar amount we're trying to achieve. It's more of a percentage of the total. And so the way that the language is written, and you can see the language it's on lines 1.16. Oh, this is from, let's see here. Is this, which one? It is House File. I'm getting confused. I had language last one. This is this year's, right? Okay, so you have a copy of this. So it's 1.16 through 1.20 on the first page. So as you can see though, there's no dollar amount referenced, but instead the formula uses percentiles. So it's a percentage of the average, the state average. It's a percentage of the formula itself, if that makes sense. It's not targeting a set dollar amount for each of the districts. I hope I'm answering your question, if I'm understanding correctly.
All right, thank you. With that, I'm going to close the discussion and move that House File 181 be recommended to pass.